Section 1.5 is all about mortgages and credit cards. And these two are very practical things that are good to understand. The reason they're lumped together is that both are examples of what are called installment loans, where you're paying off a loan that you've taken out with regular payments. Now, a credit card we'll talk about at the end is what's called an open-ended installment loan, which means that even as you're paying it off, you can be borrowing more by putting more charges on your credit card. With a mortgage, when you go to buy a house, you take out a big loan in one lump sum, and then over the course of time you pay it off with regular payments, and you don't generally borrow more, at least on that one mortgage, and then there's a structured, consistent way in which you pay it off. So we'll start with mortgages and spend most of our time in this section on those, and then credit cards are pretty simple. We'll talk about those at the end of the section. So a mortgage is a large loan that's taken out to buy something big. So most commonly this would be for a house. And that's generally the biggest purchase that you'll probably make in your life, is buying a house. And when you do so, most often you don't have the money on hand to buy it. So what you do is you take out a loan to pay for whatever amount you can't borrow, you can't afford today. So you borrow that difference. At the beginning of the section here, there's a lot of terminology, so we have to just get used to some terms, because when we start actually doing problems, we'll need to understand what these terms mean. So on this first page, you'll see a lot of bolded words. Pay attention to those especially, and then I have a summary at the end of that. So this mortgage is just a long-term loan, and the key to a mortgage is that it's secured against the house that you purchase. What that means is if you stop making payments, the bank can take the house away from you, and then they will take over ownership of it, and that's called a foreclosure. If you what's called default on your loan, that means you stop paying and you lose the house. So the house is the security for the loan. It's the collateral. There's a lot of terms here. Again, I mentioned the idea of an installment loan. It's this idea that you're paying back a loan in regular payments. Notice that that sounds a lot like an annuity, and it turns out that it's very closely related. We'll talk about that in a minute. When you do take out a loan for a house, most often you have some amount of cash on hand, even if it's a small amount. And that amount of cash you have today, you use toward the purchase of the house, and then the remainder is what you borrow. So the idea is, say you're buying a house for $100,000 and you have $10,000 today, that $10,000 would be what's called your down payment, so you would pay that today, and then the remaining $90,000 would be what you borrow. Now, there's a little bit you can read through here. The idea of a down payment is that from the bank's perspective, this gives them confidence that you're likely to pay back the loan. In other words, if you didn't have any investment in the house, if you borrowed all the money for the house, you're a riskier investment because you might just walk away, right, from the bank's perspective. So the more of a down payment you put down, the safer you look from the bank's perspective, so the more likely they are to agree to give you the loan. So I say here that typical down payments range from 10 to 20%. If you put down less than 20%, you have to pay what's called mortgage insurance. And this is basically accounting for that riskiness from the bank's perspective. If you're only putting down a tiny amount, you're more likely to default on your loan from their perspective. And so they require mortgage insurance, and they require you to pay that. And that kind of protects them against having to foreclose. If they have to do that, then they get to recoup some of their losses here. So typical down payments are from 10 to 20%. 20% obviously is the ideal that you should shoot for so that you can avoid mortgage insurance, but there are times where that's just not feasible. And there are exceptional loans like the FHA loans, the Federal Housing Administration, or VA loans, the Veterans Administration loans, and you can put down a lot less with those, like 3.5%, things like that. But generally speaking, the more you can put down for the down payment, the better off you'll be, partly because it makes you a safer investment for the bank, and so they might give you a lower interest rate, and more importantly because that means you'll pay less in interest over the course of time. So the core concept is at the beginning of this process, when you're looking to buy a house, you look at how much cash you have on hand, how much the house costs, and then you package together your cash on hand with the loan that you get, and those together make up the money you need to buy the house. So you split your cost of the house into your down payment and your loan principal. So we use the term principal there to talk about the amount that you borrow. So in the example with the $100,000 house, the $10,000 would be your down payment, the $90,000 would be the principal that you borrow to make up the difference. Mortgages are typically 30 years, that's the most standard. 15-year and 20-year mortgages are also pretty common, and you'll see those if you go out to shop for mortgages. 30 years is still kind of the standard because it gives you enough time that your monthly payments are lower. So what we're going to see, and we'll actually run through calculations on this, that the faster you pay back the loan, the less interest you end up paying. And that makes sense because it gives interest less time to accrue. But the trade-off is that you have to pay more each month. So you'll see that later on. So if you're going out to shop for a mortgage, your mortgage lender should give you a breakdown of different payment amounts and different total costs for different lengths of loans, and then you'll decide what works for you. There's a couple more terms here. You might see the term fixed rate mortgage or adjustable rate mortgage. You may see something like an ARM, an ARM. That's an adjustable rate mortgage. You can read through that. Basically, a fixed rate means that whatever interest rate they tell you day one, that'll be the same interest rate for the whole life of the loan, all 30 years or 20 years or whatever. An adjustable rate mortgage can change. So often they'll give you a better rate on an adjustable rate mortgage, but the risk is that interest rates could go up and you could have to pay more later on. So that'll be things that you'll see if you ever go shopping for a house. And then as you buy a house, you'll also run across what are called closing costs. When you buy the house, closing is when you sign all the paperwork, and at that point you have to pay a number of fees, and these are not things that go toward buying the house. So this is just money you have to pay to make the loan happen. There are things like taxes, payment to the lender, the title company, land surveys, inspections, etc., etc. There's all these line items that add up to closing costs, usually a few $1,000s, depending on how expensive the house is and what different things you have to do at closing. So it just makes sense that when you have cash on hand, not all of that cash can go toward your down payment. You have to hold some back so that you can cover closing costs. So we'll talk about that when we do an example a little later. And then the last term here I mentioned is an escrow account. This is not something that you need for any of the problems in this section, but it's just a nice thing to know about if you ever hear this term. The idea is that in addition to your loan payment, you also have property taxes and insurance are kind of the two most common things that get added to it. There could be others, but those are the two most common. And what happens is property taxes and homeowners insurance are both due at the end of the year. So what you could do is you could just pay your monthly payment to the bank, the loan payment, which we often call principal and interest, or P&I. That's the amount that we're going to calculate that you have to pay the bank each month. You could just make that payment each month and then also save up for a big lump payment at the end of the year for property taxes and insurance, which don't go to the bank, but you still have to pay them at the end of the year. However, for convenience, what the bank will actually do is they'll say, tell you what, give us a little bit of money each month toward your property taxes and toward your insurance. In other words, a 1/12 of what you would have to pay at the end of the year. Give us that as part of your monthly payment. We will set that aside for you, and at the end of the year, we will make your taxes and insurance payments. So it's a really convenient thing, and along the way, your money that you're setting aside actually earns interest too, so it's not very much, but it's a nice little added bonus. And the idea there is that then as you're budgeting monthly, it's a lot easier to keep track of those things rather than having to, at the end of the year, have this big lump sum that you pay. So when you go to calculate a mortgage, you'll have this loan payment that you actually calculate using the formulas in this section, and then you'll see also your taxes and insurance get added on top of that. Again, it depends on the cost of your house and where you live, but it might be $100 a month, it might be $300 a month. It really depends on where you are and what kind of house you have. So that's an amount that gets added on. So as you're budgeting, you can't just say, here's how much I've set aside for housing, that can be my loan payment. No, it needs to also include principal and interest. So we'll talk about that as we go through as well. Here's a quick summary of those terms. Make sure you understand these terms, because as we go through examples, it's important that we can use these things as needed. All right, you can read through this on your own. Pay attention to this paragraph here that talks about why this formula for the monthly payment is actually a familiar one. It's the same as the payment for a payout annuity. And you can read through and see why that's the case. It's basically just flipping the picture and thinking of yourself in the other position. Like if you're sitting on the other side of the table, you can think of a payout annuity looking an awful lot like a mortgage. So it turns out we don't have to do any different work. We can use the same formula we're familiar with, which makes life fairly easy. We can also use the TVM solver, the time value of money solver, to solve these problems. But as you'll see in the examples here, I'm using the formula. If you want to check it with the TVM solver or use that for your homework or test questions, that's totally fine. So at the beginning here, I start out with a car loan, which is the same idea, except that you don't have to think about closing costs and escrow accounts and all that stuff. So you can go through here, and in this example, I give you the loan amount, the principal, and then the terms of the loan, and you can go through and calculate the monthly payment. Now when you do this, you should do something that we'll do later on here, which is to multiply this payment by the number of payments you make. So you're making 60 payments here. So if you multiply 202.58 by 60 months, you can figure out how much you actually paid for the car. And then if you find the difference between that and 11,000, that'll be the amount of interest that you paid. And we'll do that with the mortgage example a little later. It's a really valuable tool to do because it gives you a good way to compare different loans, for instance, and to get a sense of how much interest you need to account for over the life of the loan. Okay, and then the question can be flipped around. We can have the monthly payment amount in mind. We can start with that value and then work backwards to find the loan amount that's possible. So you can run through that example again and watch the video on it for more details. Here's an example of kind of what I was talking about, where you figure out how much you actually pay and how much interest you pay. Again, all you need to look at is, in this case, you're putting $500 down. That's your down payment. And then you're making a monthly payment of $550 for 60 months. So if you add your down payment to the amount you make in those 60 monthly payments, you get the total amount that you're paying over the course of those 60 months or 5 years. And then you can figure out the difference between that and the price that's listed. That's how much interest you're actually paying. So you can make that assessment at the beginning before you take out a loan and see if it's worth it to you. Okay, now we can move to a mortgage example, and the core of the problem is going to be calculating the monthly payment, just like with the car loan, but there's all these extra things included in this example. So that's why it's a little bit longer, and you should go through it carefully. There's a lot of steps to it, but if you can understand this, when you go to actually buy a house, you'll actually see all of this is very realistic. The actual calculations you need to do in this problem are also pretty straightforward. It's just a matter of recognizing what each step is asking you to do and how to do that. So for instance, we're starting with the price of a condo of $180,000. So that's the sticker price. That's what you offer for this condo. And you have a 30-year mortgage. It's a fixed mortgage, meaning the interest rate is fixed at 4%. And let's say you have $32,000 in hand right now. That's what you've saved up over the course of several years. You've been saving for a house, and let's say you have $32,000 saved up. Okay, So part A says your banker tells you to expect $5,000 in closing costs. What percentage down payment can you afford, and will you need mortgage insurance? So you should go through and make sure you understand what this is asking. You can read through the problem here. You can watch the video on this example. Each of these steps is similar to that, where you have a setup that uses something that we talked about, like closing costs, and then you can figure out from that your down payment as a percentage. That's like a percentage, applied percentage problem. And then we talked about mortgage insurance as well. So all of these terms are important because as you're going through the problem, you need to recognize when to use what. So make sure you pay special attention to this example, watch the video carefully, and make sure it makes sense to you. Then I have a couple examples here where we're taking a basic loan and we're saying, okay, what if we tweak just the interest rate? If everything else stays the same, and we tweak the interest rate, what changes about it? And then what if we change the loan amount? Or what if we change the length of the loan? How much difference is there in the amount that we'll pay at the end? So you should go through examples 5, 6, and 7. Again, look at them carefully, watch the videos, make sure the concept makes sense to you. The punchline at the end of each of them is kind of the thing to pay attention to more than the actual numbers, just to get a sense of what happens when you change the interest rate or the loan amount, etc. Okay, then we get to another concept, which is an amortization table. And the idea is when you take out a mortgage, you're going to get a big stack of paper with lots and lots of things in it. One of the things you're going to see is what's called an amortization table. It's really simple to calculate, but it's just a big long table of numbers. And the idea is it shows you each monthly payment you're going to make. So if you have a 30-year loan, if you're making 12 payments a year, you're going to have 360 payments. And so it'll have a table with 360 rows in it, and each row is one payment. And what each row will show you is, of your payment, how much of it is actually going to pay off the balance of the loan, and how much of it is paying off interest that month. And what you'll see is at the beginning, when your balance is really high, is the highest it will be, then a good chunk of your payment is paying off interest. The interest you owe that month is fairly high. But as time goes on and as your balance drops, you owe less and less in interest. Now you're making the same monthly payment every month. So as you're paying less in interest, more of it is going toward the principal. Now, you just make your monthly payment each month. You don't see the details of this. You just give them the money and slowly watch your balance drop. But it's interesting to see how that happens, and understanding what an amortization table does is a useful tool. So here's a description of the amortization table. Some people draw them slightly differently, but the basic information tends to be the same, where you have the payments listed, and then how much of that payment goes toward interest, how much goes toward principal, and then the current loan balance at the end of that month. So I have an example here. You should go through and watch the video on this one as well, read through it carefully, make sure you can do it. For the homework or on a test, you might need to do like 1 or 2 payments, like I do here in this example, but then the rest of the table, you wouldn't do all 240 or 360 or whatever payments by hand. That would be incredibly tedious. But here what I've got is just a sort of truncated version where I've cut out some rows just to show you kind of what happens over time, that your balance drops over time, eventually dropping all the way to 0, and your interest payments are also dropping, and as they do, your principal payments are increasing at the same rate. Okay, then I have a section on creating amortization tables using Excel. This is mostly just for your interest. It's not something you'll have to do for homework or anything, but you can read through this. There's a lot of details in there that you can follow through on your own. And that's mortgages. That's all you really need to know. So there's kind of one big example with mortgages. You'll see other examples like that in the homework and on the test and project. So then we get to credit cards, and credit cards are the same kind of idea where you're paying off your balance with payments, but these payments are a little less structured. in the sense that you can keep making charges on your credit card and you can pay off different amounts at different times. So it's an open-ended installment loan. It's the same idea, but it's not as structured as a mortgage. You should read through this carefully. When you calculate the interest you owe each month, because your balance changes throughout the month, on the 1st of the month and on the 15th of the month, you might have different balances on your credit card. The credit card company needs a way to calculate a single number for what you owe. So what most of them do is what's called the average daily balance. Basically what they do is they take the balance each day and they take the average of them. So they add up the balance on the first day and the second day and the third day all the way to the 30th, and then they divide that by 30 if there's 30 days in the month. So you'll see how to do that in practice here. You could just add up 30 numbers and then divide by 30, but there's a little bit of a shortcut, and you'll see that as you go through the examples here. So again, pay attention to this example, especially watch the video for it and go through it carefully, because you'll see homework questions and test questions that are very similar to that. And then that's pretty much it. That's the whole section. So there's one credit card example because that's really all you need. All the others are the same setup, pretty much exactly. There's a little note here on minimum payments on credit cards and just talking about why you should make more than the minimum payment. But as far as calculations go, as long as you can work through this example and this try it, things like that, you should be pretty well set for credit cards. So that's section 1.5, mortgages and credit cards, both installment loans.